Hello, folks. We're taking a look today at Philippians chapter 1, verses 7 through 14, and it's going to be a brief look. We're just going to make a few comments on just some of the verses here. This is such a rich text, don't you agree? I mean, such a rich text. Well, in this section, Paul speaks of his great love for the Philippians, and he tells them of what he's praying for them. And then he begins a series of reflections on what's going on in his life at the present time, that is, his imprisonment. First of all, I want us to notice that Paul declares the depth of his feeling for the Philippians in verse 8. In effect, he says to them, God himself knows how I feel about you. And I want you to notice in particular how many times Paul talks about his love for all of you. We have that phrase in verse 3, and then it's found again twice in verse 7, and we find it again in verse 8. My love, my concern for all of you. And so, 4 times in these opening verses, he tells them that he loves all of them. Now, I think that's interesting, because you know that some of the people that he's writing to may, by their antics, show that, they might be hard to love. For example, in chapter 1 and verse 27, he talks about those who might not be so united, not of the same mind with everyone else. And then, of course, in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, he speaks of Euodia and Syntyche, who are having a hard time getting along. And underneath the surface of Philippians, there seems to be this secondary theme that there's a little bit of conflict going on in the church there, maybe a little bit of disunity. And so I think it's interesting that Paul says, I have a great love for all of you, even for those of you whose antics often seem to bring more grief than pleasure. And of course, we can learn a lot from that, can't we? Our love should extend not only to the people who bring us joy and pleasure, but also to the people who often get under our skin. Well, now I want you to notice his prayer in the following verses. First of all, he prays for what? An ever-increasing love for the Philippians. This seems to be a common prayer that Paul makes for all of his churches. Thessalonica, for example, he prayed for an ever-increasing love among them. But his second request is for an ever-increasing knowledge and insight. And we might slip in some words here and say that he's praying for an ever-increasing knowledge of God and his will, and for moral insight among the Philippians. Now, why does he pray for these things? These phrases are followed by purpose clauses. Paul is giving us the purpose for these particular requests. And he tells us that he prays for these things because he wants them to have insight in order to determine what is best. Paul wants them to know what really counts. He wants them to make a proper assessment of what really has value in life. He's praying for the ability to discern. And he knows that if they will grow in their love for each other, and if they will grow in the knowledge of God and in moral insight, then they will be able to discern what is best in life. And the ultimate purpose of his prayer and the request that he makes is what? That they will be pure and blameless until the day of Christ. So Paul has in mind in this prayer that they'll be ready to meet the Lord, and he asks God to make them ready to meet the Lord at the last day. Now for a few thoughts on his reflections on his imprisonment. You'll notice that he speaks of the advance of the gospel as a result of his imprisonment. Instead of his circumstances being a hindrance to the spread of the gospel, they have in fact led to its advance. And of course, I'm just so impressed with Paul that he would even be concerned about this. As he sits in this prison cell, he's concerned for the advance of the gospel, and he sees that this is a serendipity, I guess. This is a byproduct of being in chains that the gospel of Christ has spread. First, it has spread within those who work in those prison walls, the gospel had become known throughout the emperor's elite troops. Boy, I had a hard time saying that, didn't I? They all came to know the reason for his chains, and so the gospel had spread to the higher echelons of the Roman military because Paul was in chains. That's amazing. Christ had become known throughout the military at those higher echelons because Paul was in prison. Enough of that. But the gospel had also come to be known outside of those prison cells. How so? Because his imprisonment had had an effect upon the Christian community in Rome. Did it make them wary of speaking up for Christ? No. In fact, quite the contrary. It caused them to speak the word about Christ with boldness and fearlessness. So God had used Paul's curtailment to prod others into greater service. What a God we serve, right? I want to talk about application just a little bit, and there's so much in this text that we can apply. But first of all, I want us to notice again the focus of Paul's concern. What is it? The focus of his concern is not himself or what's going on in his life. It's Christ and the gospel. The furtherance of the gospel is everything for Paul. And so I'm wondering, what is it for us? Is Christ our focus? Is Christ our passion? Is the furtherance of the gospel so important to us? Is Christ and the good news our chief concern? Well, I've got some growing to do in that regard. How about you? And can we learn to pray like Paul? Oh my goodness. What a prayer this is in chapter 1. He prays for an ever-increasing love for others that will lead to an ever-increasing knowledge of God and moral insight, all of which leads to fruitfulness, verse 11, in the ways of righteousness, which leads to our readiness to meet the Lord at the last day. Do we pray like this? I'm afraid sometimes we limit our prayers and our requests to more trivial matters. What do you think? But I want to be able to pray the way Paul prays. And so maybe I should start by praying that I will grow in my love for all people, in my Christian family and outside of my Christian family. Those who profess faith in Jesus and those who don't. Those who tend to get under my skin in the Lord's church and those whom I consider to be good friends. I need to pray for an ever-increasing love for all people and for an ever-increasing knowledge of God and His will. Well, what a great prayer. Paul is our model for how to pray. Now, a brief preview of our coming verses. Chapter 1, verses 15 through 26. The gospel advances outside of prison, and that is despite the ill will of some people. We're going to read about Paul's ambition. What is it? That Christ is glorified. The desired outcome of Paul's life, to be with Christ, verse 21. And the expected outcome, reunion in Philippi. This is such a great chapter, don't you agree? How rich and meaningful it is. And again, I thank you for spending time in this text with me. It's a joy. God bless.